The Muppets looks like one of the safest, happiest movies Disney could possibly make. It has bright colors, familiar faces, celebrity cameos, ridiculous jokes, musical numbers, and a frog who has spent his entire existence telling people that everything is going to be okay. But underneath all of that warmth is a surprisingly frightening idea. What if the thing you loved as a child could simply disappear? Not explode in some dramatic finale. Not die in a way that gives you closure. Just fade. The lights stop turning on. The audience stops coming. The theater gathers dust. The characters stop being culturally necessary. And eventually the world moves on as though they were never there. That is the strange emotional reality hiding inside The Muppets, the 2011 film that looks like a cheerful Disney musical, while quietly behaving like a meta-horror story about cultural erasure. The Muppets are not merely trying to save a building. They are trying to prove that they still deserve to exist. In the 1970s, that question barely needed to be asked. The Muppet Show had become a television phenomenon because Jim Henson and his collaborators understood something television had rarely seen before. Puppets could be sophisticated, chaotic, musical, absurd, and emotionally sincere at the same time. Kermit could interview a celebrity, Fozzie could bomb on stage, Miss Piggy could destroy an entire room, Animal could attack a drum kit, and somehow all of it felt like the same impossible world. The Muppets were everywhere. They were television stars, movie stars, toys, records, books, advertisements, and childhood memories being created in real time. But by 2011, the cultural environment had changed completely. Attention had fragmented. Television had multiplied. CGI had become increasingly dominant. The internet had transformed entertainment into an endless stream of instantly replaceable images. A character no longer needed to be famous for decades to become recognizable. A meme could become enormous overnight and disappear the following week. And suddenly the Muppets, with their felt faces, visible seams, rods, foam bodies, and old-fashioned vaudeville instincts, seemed almost absurdly vulnerable. That is why the abandoned Muppet Theater is one of the most emotionally important locations in the entire film. On paper, it is just an old building. Dramatically, it is a graveyard. The dust, the empty seats, the neglected rooms, and the silence transform a place once designed for laughter into a physical representation of forgotten childhood. The theater resembles those pieces of our own past that seemed permanent when we were young but become strangely fragile once we grow older. The room is still there, but the people who filled it have changed. The memories remain, but the world that created them has moved forward. Kermit understands this loneliness better than anyone. His optimism no longer comes from ignorance, comes from experience. He knows what it feels like to be loved and then forgotten. He knows that people can applaud you for years and eventually stop showing up. The brilliance of the Muppets is that it never treats this fear with the grim seriousness of a conventional drama. Instead, it hides existential anxiety inside jokes, songs, felt faces, and ridiculous celebrity cameos. The characters are terrified of becoming irrelevant, but they respond to that terror by attempting the most Muppet-like thing imaginable: putting on a show. And that gives us the question that will quietly control everything that follows. Can pure optimism survive in a cynical digital era? Can sincerity still create a community when attention has become a commodity? Can something handmade compete with something infinitely reproducible? And perhaps most importantly, can a character created for one generation become emotionally meaningful to another? Those questions are what make the Muppets far more complicated than its colorful surface suggests. Because once we stop seeing these characters as puppets and start seeing them as fragile cultural icons, the entire movie changes. What looks like a reunion story becomes a story about mortality. What looks like nostalgia becomes a negotiation with the past. And what looks like a children's musical begins to resemble a desperate argument for why joy itself is still worth protecting. To understand why that argument works, we have to move beyond the plot and examine the machinery underneath it. The Muppets is fascinating because almost every layer of the production is participating in the same conversation. The screenplay by Jason Segel and Nicholas Stoller is not simply trying to bring Kermit and his friends back. It is asking what happens when a beloved cultural institution realizes that its own mythology has become larger than its current relevance. The production history matters because the movie's emotional sincerity did not appear by accident. It came from people who genuinely believed that the Muppets still had something to say. So our journey through this film has to move in several directions at once. We will trace how the project emerged from Segel's unusual passion for the characters, and how that passion collided with the realities of modern studio filmmaking. We will examine James Bobin's direction, and the decision to preserve practical puppetry at a time when digital spectacle was becoming the dominant visual language of blockbuster entertainment. We will look at the film's music, particularly Bret McKenzie's songs, because the emotional architecture of the Muppets is inseparable from its melodies. The songs do not simply decorate the story. They expose what the characters cannot say directly. We will also examine the psychology of Walter, perhaps the most important new character in the entire film, because Walter is effectively the audience made flesh, or rather felt. He is a fan who has spent his life consuming the Muppets from a distance, memorizing their jokes, studying their performances, and imagining himself as part of their world. That makes his journey unexpectedly close to the psychology of modern fandom. Walter does not merely love the Muppets. He has built part of his identity around loving them, and that creates a fascinating contradiction. He desperately wants to belong to the world he worships, but he has never seriously considered that he might have to contribute something to it. His story therefore becomes a transition from passive nostalgia to active participation. That idea will become essential later, because the Muppets ultimately argues that nostalgia becomes destructive when we only consume the past. It becomes constructive when we use the past to create something new. We will also examine Kermit, whose emotional journey carries an entirely different burden. He is not simply a character returning to the spotlight. He is the symbolic custodian of an entire creative legacy. Every time he hesitates, every time he looks at the empty theater, every time he questions whether the group can ever be what it once was, the film is quietly asking what happens when an artistic tradition has to continue without its original creator. And that brings us to the ghost of Jim Henson, which hangs over the movie without ever needing to be explicitly invoked in every scene. Henson died long before this film was made, but the question of continuation is everywhere. Can the Muppets remain themselves when the person who gave them their original creative identity is gone? The answer is complicated, and the Muppets is strongest when it allows that complication to exist beneath its comedy. We will also examine Disney's role, because there is a delicious irony at the center of this entire production. The studio that owns the Muppets is making a movie about how the Muppets have been neglected. The corporation funding the resurrection is simultaneously being represented by the forces that threaten the characters' home. That contradiction gives the movie an unusual layer of metatextual tension. And when we reach the final act, the emotional payoff will depend on understanding one crucial distinction. saving the theater is not necessarily the same thing as saving the Muppets. The film knows that buildings can be destroyed and franchises can be shelved. What cannot be manufactured quite so easily is genuine affection. That is why revisiting this movie years later produces an even stranger emotional effect. In 2011, it looked like a nostalgic comeback. From a greater distance, it looks almost prophetic. It understands that the future of entertainment would become increasingly obsessed with revivals, sequels, legacy characters, and audiences being asked to reconnect with things they once loved. But The Muppets does something many later revivals struggle to do. It does not merely ask us to remember. It asks us what remembering is supposed to accomplish. And before we analyze any of that, there is something more personal we need to acknowledge. You may not have grown up watching The Muppet Show every week. You may not remember exactly when you first met Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie, Gonzo, Animal, or the rest of the gang. You may have encountered them through a movie, a television rerun, a VHS tape, a DVD, a toy, a random clip online, or simply through the cultural memory that tells you who these characters are. But the emotional language of the Muppets is remarkably easy to recognize. It is the warmth of old television lighting. It is the tactile sensation of felt and foam. It is the strange imperfection of a puppet face moving just slightly too much or slightly too little. It is the sound of a character's footsteps, the exaggerated physicality of an argument, the sudden appearance of a celebrity who seems perfectly comfortable behaving like an idiot. There is something deeply comforting about seeing evidence of the human hand inside the illusion. Modern digital characters can be astonishingly detailed, but a Muppet often looks like someone is physically making it exist in front of you. That changes the emotional relationship. You do not just watch the character move. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that somebody is inside the performance, reaching through fabric and foam to create an expression. The illusion is visible, and that visibility becomes part of the charm. For many viewers, childhood is the first period of life when fictional characters feel almost permanently available. We assume the shows will always exist. The actors will always be young. The characters will always be funny. The places we associate with them will always remain emotionally intact. Then adulthood arrives and teaches us a more complicated lesson. Childhood heroes age. Performers die. Studios change ownership. Television shows disappear. Characters get redesigned. Franchises are rebooted. And sometimes the thing you remember most vividly is something that the culture around you has almost completely forgotten. That realization can hurt more than expected because nostalgia is not just remembering the past. It is discovering that the past cannot be recovered exactly as you left it. The Muppets understands this. It could have simply filled the screen with references and expected audiences to clap whenever they recognized something. Instead, it turns nostalgia into a source of conflict. Walter wants the old Muppets back so badly that he struggles to imagine a future for them. Kermit fears that the past was better than anything they can make now. Gary has to learn that loving the world of his childhood cannot excuse avoiding adulthood. Even Miss Piggy and Kermit are trapped inside a history they cannot simply pretend never happened. The movie weaponizes nostalgia, but it does not use nostalgia as a blunt instrument. It uses it as emotional pressure. Every familiar song carries the memory of previous versions. Every old character creates a question about where that character has been. Every joke about the Muppets' age quietly reminds us that the audience has aged too. That is why the film's self-awareness matters. It knows that you remember. It knows that you are older. It knows that the franchise is not what it was in the 1970s, and rather than hiding that fact, it puts that uncomfortable truth directly into the story. The result is a revival that feels less like a museum exhibit and more like an argument between generations. The old Muppets are asking whether they still have a place in the world. The new audience is being asked whether it is willing to make room for them. And if you understand that exchange, you begin to understand why the Muppets is more important to the modern revival era than it initially appears. Before studios perfected the formula of resurrecting old properties by combining legacy characters with new protagonists, this movie was already experimenting with that balance. It understood that the audience cannot simply be told that the past matters. The audience has to feel why it matters. And that difference is enormous. The story of how the film came into existence is almost as unlikely as the story inside it. Jason Segel had already demonstrated an unusual affection for the Muppets before the Muppets existed as a modern Disney production. At the end of Forgetting Sarah Marshall, the joke about putting on a Puppet Dracula musical was not merely a random comedy gag. Segel's fascination with puppetry and classic Muppet storytelling was genuine, and he began developing an idea for a revival with Nicholas Stoller. The audacity of the concept was not simply that they wanted to make another Muppet movie. It was that they wanted to make a Muppet movie that admitted the Muppets needed saving. They wanted to make a story about a character who loved the franchise so much that he had to convince the original characters to care about themselves again. That structure allowed the film to solve a difficult creative problem. How do you reintroduce an old franchise without pretending the decades between installments never happened? The answer was to make the gap itself part of the story. The Muppets had been absent because they had lost momentum. Kermit was distant. The theater was abandoned. The group had fragmented. Their cultural relevance had become uncertain. In other words, the fictional problem reflected the real-world problem. Disney had acquired the Muppets brand in 2004, after years of complicated corporate history surrounding Jim Henson's creations. Yet ownership alone could not automatically restore the cultural phenomenon that had existed during Henson's era. A company can own characters, trademarks, archives, and distribution rights. It cannot simply purchase the emotional relationship audiences have with those characters. That has to be rebuilt. This distinction is essential to understanding why Segel's pitch mattered. The project was not attempting to convince audiences that the Muppets were still exactly the same. It was attempting to convince audiences that the Muppets could become relevant again by acknowledging what had changed. James Bobin eventually became the director, bringing with him a comedic background deeply compatible with the Muppets' unusual rhythm. His work on Flight of the Conchords demonstrated an ability to combine musical performance with deadpan absurdity, awkward pauses, bizarre visual behavior, and characters who could remain emotionally sincere while behaving completely irrationally. That sensibility proved valuable, because the Muppets have always lived in a peculiar space between theatrical performance and comedy sketch. Their world can collapse the fourth wall without destroying the emotional stakes. Characters can know they are in a show, and still genuinely care about what happens to them. Bobin understood that the key was not to make the Muppets modern by stripping away their old identity. It was to let their old identity collide with modern filmmaking. That principle also shaped the visual production. At a time when digital effects could make almost anything move, the filmmakers deliberately leaned into practical puppetry. Rods, performers, hidden operators, floor work, open frame techniques, and physical staging became central to the visual language. This was not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. Practical puppetry created a texture that CGI could imitate but not completely replace. The characters had weight. Their bodies bent and compressed. Their fabric reacted to movement. Their expressions were tied to physical performance rather than digital animation. Even when digital cleanup removed rods or other production elements, the underlying performance remained physical. That distinction is crucial. The filmmakers were not trying to pretend that modern technology did not exist. They were using modern technology to protect an older form of performance. The result was a fascinating compromise between eras. The Muppets could exist inside a high-definition cinematic environment without being transformed into digital creatures. Their imperfections remained visible. Their physicality remained central. Their world still looked handmade, and that handmade quality became part of the emotional argument. In an industry increasingly obsessed with making images smoother, larger, cleaner, and more spectacular, the Muppets made imperfection feel expensive. The film effectively argued that you could spend millions of dollars on a movie and still allow the audience to see the seams. In fact, those seams could be exactly what made the experience feel alive. That decision became even more important because the cultural landscape of 2011 was not particularly welcoming to a revival built around felt puppets. Hollywood was increasingly dominated by visual effects, superhero franchises, gritty reboots, fantasy adaptations, and increasingly self-conscious forms of youth entertainment. The idea that audiences would line up for a movie about 1970s-style vaudeville puppets was not automatically absurd, but it was certainly a gamble. The Muppets had brand recognition, but recognition and relevance are not the same thing. A character can be famous and still feel distant from the cultural conversation. The question Disney had to answer was brutally simple. Did children in 2011 actually care about Kermit? And if they did not, could their parents care enough to bring them? That created a rare cross-generational challenge. The movie needed to satisfy people who remembered the original Muppets without becoming a nostalgia machine that only adults could understand. At the same time, it needed enough energy and humor to convince younger viewers that these strange felt creatures were worth following. Disney's marketing strategy understood that problem almost perfectly. Rather than pretending the movie was a conventional children's adventure, the promotional campaign leaned into parody and self-awareness. Trailers mimicked the tone of films like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Twilight, and Green Lantern, using the absurdity of the Muppets to spoof contemporary movie marketing itself. The joke was not simply that the Muppets were appearing in genres they did not belong in. The deeper joke was that the audience already understood how modern movie advertising worked. By making the Muppets participate in that language, the campaign positioned them as culturally aware rather than culturally obsolete. It effectively said, "These characters know what year it is. They know the world has changed. They know they are old-fashioned. And they are funny enough to make that old-fashioned quality part of the joke." This mattered because the film was carrying a genuine corporate risk. Disney was not merely releasing another inexpensive comedy. It was testing whether an acquired legacy property could still support theatrical filmmaking. If the film failed, the Muppets could easily have returned to the status of a dormant brand used for occasional merchandise, television appearances, and nostalgia events. The theatrical failure of a comeback could have reinforced the belief that the characters belonged to another era. The marketing therefore had to do something unusual: sell nostalgia without making the movie look old. That balance became one of the film's greatest achievements. It did not advertise the Muppets as a relic. It advertised them as a joke that understood the joke. And that distinction gave the characters a chance to enter a new cultural environment without pretending to have originated there. The film itself begins in Smalltown, USA, and immediately establishes a reality that is both bizarre and completely normal within the story. Walter is a tiny Muppet living alongside his human brother Gary, and nobody around them seems particularly shocked by the arrangement. This is important because the movie does not waste time explaining why a puppet and a human can grow up as brothers. It simply accepts the premise, just as the Muppets have always accepted the impossible. That confidence creates the first layer of the film's charm. Smalltown is almost aggressively idealized, a hyper-real musical version of childhood, where the environment seems designed to accommodate optimism. The colors are bright, the spaces feel welcoming, and the world appears to operate according to the logic of a family-friendly musical. It is a place where life can be summarized through a song before anyone has had time to question whether the song is true. That is exactly what happens with Life's a Happy Song. On the surface, the number is pure Muppet joy. Gary and Walter move through their environment with the confidence of people who believe happiness is not only possible, but practically guaranteed. Yet the song becomes more interesting when viewed as dramatic irony. The characters are singing the emotional philosophy the movie will spend the rest of its runtime challenging. Life may be a happy song, but what happens when the melody changes? Gary and Walter's relationship is the emotional center of this opening, because they are not simply brothers. They have grown up together inside a world where their differences have never seemed important. Gary is human, Walter is a puppet, but both are united by their obsession with the Muppets. Their shared fandom becomes a private language, a bond that protects Walter from feeling entirely alien. For Walter, the Muppets are more than entertainment. They are proof that a creature like him can have a place in the world. He watches their performances and sees a future version of himself reflected back. Gary, meanwhile, has grown into a life where the Muppets remain part of his identity, but are no longer the only thing defining him. That difference becomes increasingly important when Mary enters the story. Amy Adams' Mary is not simply the girlfriend waiting for Gary to grow up. She represents the adult world pressing gently against the protective bubble Gary and Walter have created. She loves Gary, but she also wants a life that moves forward. Her patience is affectionate rather than cruel, which makes the eventual conflict more emotionally believable. When the characters leave Smalltown and travel toward Los Angeles, the movie visually moves from fantasy into reality. Smalltown feels like a place designed by memory. Los Angeles feels indifferent. The scale changes. The colors become less comforting. The city does not care that Walter has spent his entire life believing the Muppets are important. It does not pause to welcome him. That contrast is the first major crack in the film's opening optimism. Childhood taught Walter that the Muppets mattered because everyone around him accepted that truth. Los Angeles asks him to prove it. The trip to the Muppet Studios lot turns that anxiety into physical evidence. Walter sneaks into the neglected property and begins exploring a place that should feel sacred to him. Instead, it feels abandoned. The dusty rooms, forgotten objects, and decayed spaces transform the studio into an archaeological site. This is the birthplace of the culture Walter worships, yet it looks as though nobody has cared about it for years. The discovery becomes even more devastating when Walter overhears Tex Richmond's plan to acquire the theater and destroy it. Richmond is not interested in the emotional history of the place. He sees property, oil rights, money, and opportunity. The theater's value is measured in financial terms, while Walter sees something priceless that cannot appear on a balance sheet. The loophole in the contract gives the Muppets a chance, but only if they can raise $10 million and reclaim the property before Richmond does. Suddenly, the abstract fear of irrelevance becomes a countdown. Walter does what any devoted fan might do when confronted with the possibility of losing the thing that shaped his identity. He tries to find its greatest representative. That representative is Kermit. Yet the Kermit Walter discovers is not the eternally optimistic frog preserved inside childhood memory. He is alone, His mansion is quiet. The energy that once surrounded him has disappeared. The image is almost haunting because Kermit has become the emotional equivalent of the abandoned theater. He is still recognizable, still famous, still fundamentally Kermit, but the community that gave his existence meaning has fragmented. The old leader has become a man, or rather a frog, living inside the ruins of his own mythology. Walter's excitement at meeting him collides with Kermit's reluctance to return. Kermit does not want to repeat the past because he knows how painful it can be when the past fails to return exactly as remembered. Walter sees a hero. Kermit sees a responsibility. That difference creates one of the most important relationships in the film. Walter needs Kermit to believe again, while Kermit needs Walter to understand that loving something does not mean expecting it to remain unchanged. Eventually, Gary, Walter, and Kermit form the core trio that will attempt the impossible. Their mission is not merely to save a theater. They have to convince a group of scattered performers to return to a show that may no longer have an audience. Every step toward that goal is therefore also a confrontation with failure. They are crossing a threshold into a world where nostalgia has to become action. And for Kermit especially, that means reopening wounds he had spent years trying to leave alone. The recruitment journey is one of the movie's funniest sequences precisely because every joke carries a little sadness underneath it. Fozzie is performing with the Muppets, a cheap imitation of the Muppets that exists as a kind of grotesque mirror image of the real group. The Muppets are recognizable enough to trigger the audience's memory, but artificial enough to feel wrong. Their existence is an elegant joke about franchise culture itself. When something becomes famous, imitations appear. The original can become less visible while cheaper versions continue making money from the same recognizable shapes. Fozzie, once a central performer, is now working in a world where his identity has been reduced to imitation. Gonzo has gone in the opposite direction. He has achieved corporate success, becoming the head of a plumbing empire. But that success has not necessarily made him happier. His story is funny because the absurdity of Gonzo being a corporate executive is itself a joke. Yet the joke also reflects a deeper question. What happens when someone leaves the creative world and becomes successful in a completely different one? Animal's anger management setting provides another variation. The character who once represented uncontrolled chaos has been placed in an environment specifically designed to control him. The irony is obvious, but it also suggests that the world has tried to domesticate the very qualities that made the Muppets distinctive. Then there is Miss Piggy, now living in Paris and working in fashion. Her setting allows the movie to parody The Devil Wears Prada while simultaneously giving Piggy a believable form of independence. She is successful without Kermit, but she is not emotionally finished with him. The recruitment sequence therefore operates on two levels. It is a comedy montage about where everyone's lives have gone, but it is also an inventory of fragmentation. The Muppets did not disappear because one villain destroyed them. They disappeared because everyone gradually moved somewhere else. That is a much more realistic form of cultural death. Eventually the group is reunited, but reunion does not automatically restore relevance. Their first major confrontation with the modern entertainment industry proves that. Veronica, played by Rashida Jones, represents a network executive culture built around metrics, demographics, schedules, ratings, and market calculations. The Muppets can explain why their show matters emotionally, but emotion is difficult to translate into a spreadsheet. Their old format seems quaint. Their appeal seems uncertain. The executives are not necessarily villains. They are simply operating inside a system that asks different questions. How many viewers? What demographic? What trend? What market? What is the return? The Muppets have spent their lives answering a completely different question. Is this funny? That collision between artistic value and measurable value is one of the film's central conflicts. The Muppets are being asked to prove their relevance using the language of a culture that has already decided relevance should be measurable. Their opportunity finally arrives in the most humiliating way possible. They do not receive a prestigious comeback slot because a network executive suddenly understands their genius. They get a telethon because another program has been canceled. They are emergency filler. Cheap, desperate, available content. The premise is almost cruelly appropriate. A franchise that once dominated television has become the backup plan for an empty schedule. And yet this humiliation gives them exactly what they need: a stage. The problem is that a stage alone cannot create a successful performance. They have only 24 hours to prepare, and their old routines collide with modern expectations in increasingly disastrous ways. Rehearsals fall apart. Performers argue. Timing fails. The group discovers that simply remembering how things used to work does not guarantee that the old formula still works now. Kermit, who has spent the entire story trying to protect everyone from disappointment, finally breaks down under the pressure. His conflict with Miss Piggy exposes another dimension of the group's history. They are not merely colleagues. They are people who have hurt each other, separated, and accumulated decades of emotional baggage. Piggy's ultimatum forces Kermit to confront the fact that leadership has become another form of avoidance. He can keep worrying about whether the Muppets are worth saving, or he can actually save them by trusting the people around him. At the same time, Gary's relationship with Mary reaches its own breaking point. Gary's devotion to Walter has always been loving, but it has also allowed him to remain emotionally frozen. He keeps choosing the world of childhood because adulthood feels like a threat to the identity he shares with his brother. Mary does not hate Walter. She simply refuses to accept that Gary's loyalty to childhood should prevent him from building a future. That makes the parallel between Gary and Kermit especially powerful. Both men are afraid of moving forward because moving forward requires admitting that the past is over. Both must learn that loving what came before does not mean living inside it forever. That emotional realization reaches its clearest expression in Man or Muppet. The song is funny because its premise is absurdly simple, but its psychology is surprisingly sophisticated. Walter and Gary are forced to confront questions about identity, belonging, masculinity, adulthood, and self-definition. The song transforms a ridiculous question into a sincere existential crisis. Am I a man or am I a Muppet? Beneath the joke is another question. Who am I when the identity I inherited no longer tells me what to do? Walter has spent his life looking toward the Muppets for an answer. Gary has spent his life protecting Walter from feeling different. Now both must step beyond the identities that once kept them safe. When the telethon finally begins, everything seems to go wrong. That is exactly what makes the eventual success feel earned. The show does not become triumphant because everyone suddenly becomes competent. It becomes triumphant because the audience starts responding to the sincerity underneath the chaos. Jack Black's hostage-hosting gag turns the telethon into the kind of absurd spectacle only the Muppets could produce. Celebrity appearances pile up. The pacing becomes frantic. The performances become increasingly desperate. Yet the desperation itself becomes part of the charm. They are no longer trying to recreate a perfect version of the past. They are improvising a new version of themselves. Then comes the moment that seems designed to crush the entire fantasy. The clock reaches midnight, and the Muppets are still short of the $10 million goal. They have come all this way, put themselves back together, and performed their hearts out, only to miss the number. The exact amount becomes almost painfully comic because they are only $1 short. In conventional Hollywood storytelling, this would be the moment where a hidden investor appears, a wealthy celebrity makes a donation, or some other convenient mechanism restores the theater. The Muppets instead lets the failure breathe. Tex Richmond temporarily wins. The paperwork appears to confirm that the theater is lost. The characters have apparently failed in the most literal sense. And yet the film has quietly changed the definition of success. The street crowd begins gathering. People who watched the show remembered the characters, or simply responded to the performance begin showing up. Suddenly the Muppets are surrounded by something that cannot be purchased through a corporate transaction. They have an audience, not a rating, not a demographic, not a property valuation. People. That distinction is the emotional climax. The theater can be owned by someone else, but the meaning of the Muppets belongs to the people who care about them. Even Tex Richmond's eventual change comes through absurdity rather than violence. His physical defeat is ridiculous because the Muppets do not belong in a serious action movie. The conflict resolves through comedy, community, and an emotional recognition that the characters have been trying to force the world to give them something it was already willing to give. Love. The final revelation is therefore larger than the deed to a building. Cultural relevance is not created by declaring something important. It is created when people gather around it. The Muppets do not survive because a corporation decides they deserve survival. They survive because an audience decides to show up. That makes Walter the perfect protagonist for this particular story. He is not a classic Muppet hero in the traditional sense. He is smaller, quieter, more anxious, and initially more comfortable watching them performing. But that is precisely why he works. Walter is the audience. More specifically, he represents the emotional experience of being a fan. He has built a relationship with the Muppets through media consumption. He knows their songs. He knows their history. He knows the characters better than almost anyone around him. Yet knowledge does not automatically create belonging. Walter's deepest insecurity is not simply that he is short. It is that he does not know where he belongs. He is a puppet living among humans, but he is not sure whether being a puppet automatically means he belongs with the Muppets. His physical difference becomes a symbol for a much larger identity problem. Many fans understand the feeling of being close to something culturally important, without feeling personally included in it. You can know every detail about a franchise and still wonder whether you have any place inside the community that created it. Walter's obsession, therefore, has a parasocial dimension. He has a relationship with characters who do not know him. The Muppets have shaped his understanding of himself, but until the events of the movie, they have never been able to answer him personally. That changes when he meets Kermit. Kermit becomes more than Walter's hero. He becomes a mentor, almost a surrogate father figure, because he represents the possibility that Walter's strange identity can become a creative identity. Kermit does not simply tell Walter that he is special. He eventually gives him something more valuable, a chance to participate. That distinction matters. The film could have resolved Walter's insecurity by having someone reassure him that he was always a Muppet. Instead, it makes him prove that identity through action. His climactic whistle is important because it is not a random talent reveal. It is the moment when Walter stops consuming the Muppets and starts contributing to them. He is no longer just the person who knows what the Muppets used to be. He becomes part of what they can become. That is why his acceptance as a Muppet feels emotionally satisfying. He does not earn belonging by changing himself into someone else. He earns it by accepting the qualities that made him feel different. The Muppets have always been outsiders who turned their differences into performance. Walter finally understands that the same philosophy applies to him. Kermit becomes a bridge between generations. The old leader does not simply preserve the franchise. He passes its philosophy to someone new. In that sense, Walter's story is also the film's argument for the survival of the Muppets. A franchise does not survive by keeping its original audience permanently frozen in nostalgia. It survives when someone new is allowed to inherit its values and reinterpret them. Walter is the future of the Muppets because he is not pretending to be from the past. He is a fan from a later generation who loves what came before and wants to carry it forward. His final acceptance is therefore more than a character resolution. It is a theory of cultural continuity. Tex Richmond represents the opposite philosophy. He is the embodiment of a world that measures value almost exclusively through ownership, profit, and utility. played by Chris Cooper. Richmond is an unusual Muppet villain, because he is not simply trying to defeat the heroes. He wants to destroy the physical space that contains their history because he sees the space as an asset. The theater has no emotional value on his balance sheet. The land does. That makes him a particularly effective symbol of corporate cynicism. He does not hate the Muppets because they are evil. He barely understands why anyone would care about them. Their existence interferes with his plan. That is enough. His villain song, The Muppet Show's deliberately awkward parody of a traditional villain number, turns this cynicism into comedy. Maniacal Laugh is funny precisely because it fails to deliver the smooth theatrical confidence we expect from a classic Disney antagonist. Instead of a majestic villain announcing his grand philosophy, we get a man struggling with the basic concept of evil laughter. The absurdity becomes even more revealing when we learn about his childhood trauma. Tex was apparently unable to laugh at his own 10th birthday party, creating the ridiculous emotional origin story behind his hatred of joy. It is classic Muppet logic. A potentially serious psychological wound is transformed into an intentionally stupid explanation for villainy. But even that stupidity contains a thematic point. Tex's inability to laugh is the opposite of the Muppets' worldview. They believe laughter is communal. You laugh with people. You perform for people. You fail in front of people. You become ridiculous in public and discover that the audience loves you more for it. Tex has isolated himself from that vulnerability. His corporate worldview protects him from embarrassment by converting everything into transaction. If the theater has a dollar value, there is no need to ask what it means. If the Muppets are a brand, there is no need to ask why people love them. If the property can be acquired, there is no need to understand its cultural memory. His villainy therefore comes from an inability to recognize intangible value. The joke is that he eventually loses because the Muppets defeat his worldview by being more ridiculous than he can handle. There is no need for a violent confrontation. The Muppets do not need to become superheroes. Physical comedy is enough. Tex's defeat is fitting because the thing he cannot understand becomes the thing that defeats him. You cannot destroy a community simply by acquiring its building. You cannot purchase people's memories. You cannot force affection to disappear through paperwork. The Muppets survive precisely because their value exists outside the system Tex understands. Around Walter and Tex, the supporting characters create a network of different responses to aging. Kermit is the reluctant leader, carrying the burden of being the character most closely associated with the Muppets as a whole. His hesitation feels almost like an artistic version of survivor's guilt. He remembers what the group was, but memory has become painful because it constantly compares the present with the past. He also carries the symbolic weight of Jim Henson's absence. Kermit is a character whose original creative relationship with Henson became inseparable from his identity, and every later performance inevitably raises the question of continuity. The film does not answer that question directly. Instead, it dramatizes it through Kermit's fear of leading again. Gary represents another kind of arrested development. He is a grown man whose emotional identity remains deeply connected to the childhood world he shared with Walter. His relationship with Mary becomes the place where that immaturity finally becomes visible. Mary does not ask him to abandon Walter. She asks him to stop confusing responsibility with avoidance. That is a crucial distinction. Growing up does not mean rejecting childhood. It means learning how to carry childhood with you without allowing it to control every decision. Miss Piggy offers yet another version of independence. She has built a life and career outside Kermit, But her confidence does not eliminate vulnerability. Her relationship with Kermit remains emotionally complicated because their history matters, even when their relationship is painful. She is glamorous, aggressive, vain, hilarious, and deeply sincere when it counts. That combination is what keeps her from becoming merely a caricature of celebrity diva behavior. She represents someone who has learned how to build power without necessarily learning how to stop caring. And then there are the Muppets, who might be the film's most underappreciated joke. They are cheap copies of beloved originals, which makes them a perfect representation of the way popular culture can become diluted through imitation. The Muppets look like Muppets without carrying the same emotional history. They perform recognizable behaviors without the same sense of creative purpose. They are not evil because they imitate. They are funny because their imitation reveals what happens when a cultural language becomes detached from the people who originally gave it meaning. In that sense, every major supporting character is confronting the same question from a different direction. What does it mean to remain yourself after the world that created you has changed? The film's central thematic conflict can therefore be understood as a battle between constructive nostalgia and destructive nostalgia. Destructive nostalgia says the past was perfect, and the only way to honor it is to recreate it exactly. Constructive nostalgia says the past mattered because it gave us values, techniques, relationships, and creative instincts that can still be used in the present. Walter begins with the first version. He wants the Muppets back because he wants the emotional security of the world he has imagined. But the story slowly teaches him that the Muppets cannot simply return to what they were. Kermit cannot become the same leader he was decades earlier. Gary cannot remain a child forever. The Muppets cannot expect a modern audience to behave exactly like a 1970s television audience. Even the theater itself cannot be restored to its original meaning simply through a coat of paint. What matters is what happens inside it. This is why the struggle for relevance becomes so interesting. The Muppets are effectively confronting a media culture that increasingly measures attention through numbers. In a world of algorithms, engagement rates, trending topics, and fragmented audiences, sincerity can seem inefficient. A handmade puppet show cannot necessarily compete with an endless stream of digitally optimized entertainment. But the Muppets argues that efficiency is not the same thing as meaning. Something can be incredibly easy to consume and still leave almost nothing behind. A piece of art can be old-fashioned, imperfect, and commercially modest while creating memories that last for decades. The film's concept of family follows the same logic. Family is not simply biological. It is created through shared experience, mutual loyalty, and creative collaboration. The Muppets are a family because they repeatedly choose to return to one another. They argue, separate, reunite, embarrass each other, and eventually stand together again. Their bond survives because it is active. And that leads to perhaps the boldest idea in the entire film. Sincere joy is itself a form of resistance. In a cynical culture, being openly sentimental can feel embarrassing. Irony offers protection. If you make fun of yourself first, nobody can accuse you of taking yourself seriously. The Muppets take the opposite approach. They sing about happiness without apologizing for it. They cry without disguising the emotion. They celebrate friendship without pretending that friendship is childish. That sincerity is not a weakness. It is the reason the movie works. The visual language reinforces these themes long before the characters explain them. Small Town is filled with saturated colors and soft, inviting spaces that resemble an idealized memory rather than an objective reality. Hollywood, by contrast, often feels more muted and metallic. The difference is not subtle, but it is emotionally effective. Small Town represents a world where identity feels stable. Los Angeles represents a world where identity must compete for attention. The abandoned studio sits between those two environments as a physical expression of cultural decay. Dust and cobwebs are not merely signs that the building has been unused. They make time visible. Every layer of dust represents another year in which nobody returned. Shadows transform familiar objects into ghostly remnants. The theater becomes less like a stage and more like a museum. That museum quality becomes particularly powerful when Kermit walks through spaces filled with reminders of the group's history. The portraits and objects surrounding him turn his memories into physical artifacts. He is not simply remembering his friends. He is walking through evidence that they once existed together. The visual effect is almost funereal without ever becoming depressing. It allows the film to make its most serious argument without abandoning its tone. Even costume design participates in the emotional progression. Gary and Walter often resemble one another visually, reinforcing their childhood bond and shared identity. Their similarities create a visual shorthand for their emotional codependency. As Gary begins choosing Mary and adulthood, those matching signals gradually become less dominant. He is not abandoning Walter, but he is changing the shape of their relationship. That distinction is important because the film does not present maturity as betrayal. It presents maturity as differentiation. Two people can remain brothers without needing to occupy exactly the same emotional space. The visual design, therefore, supports the psychological argument. Color, space, clothing, and lighting all communicate degrees of belonging and isolation. When characters are surrounded by people, the frame often feels warmer and more alive. When Kermit is alone, the same character suddenly looks smaller. The Muppet body remains unchanged, but context changes its emotional scale. That is one of the advantages of practical puppetry. A puppet can look simultaneously artificial and deeply vulnerable. The seams remain visible, yet the eyes can still communicate loneliness. The deeper meaning becomes even more complicated when we consider the film's relationship with Disney itself. The Muppets are owned by a major corporation. Yet the movie's central conflict involves a corporate force threatening to destroy the cultural home of the characters. That is almost too perfect to be accidental. The studio is effectively financing a film that jokes about the consequences of corporate neglect. It is a rare form of self-criticism disguised as family entertainment. The theater can be read as a metaphor for the Muppets' position inside a large media corporation. Technically owned, legally protected, commercially valuable, and yet potentially neglected if executives do not know what to do with them. The film's meta-humor allows it to acknowledge that contradiction without turning into a corporate lecture. The Muppets know they are a property. They also know that being property is not the same thing as being alive. That is where the ghost of Jim Henson becomes impossible to ignore. Henson's absence creates a philosophical problem for the characters. A creation can outlive its creator, but what does it become afterward? Does continuity mean preserving the original exactly? Does it mean allowing other artists to reinterpret the work? Does it mean accepting that the creation will inevitably become something different? Kermit's reluctance embodies that anxiety. He fears that returning will not restore the old Muppets. It might expose how much has changed. Yet the film ultimately argues that continuation is not betrayal. A creation can honor its origin by evolving. Puppetry itself makes this philosophy visible. A puppet is a constructed object, but audiences willingly project emotion onto it. The felt body becomes a container for human anxieties about identity, loneliness, ambition, fear, love, and belonging. The fact that we can see the artificiality does not prevent us from believing in the character. In fact, the artificiality may make the emotional experience stronger. We know Kermit is a puppet, but his sadness can still hurt. We know Walter is made of fabric, but his insecurity can still feel painfully human. That is the existential beauty of puppetry. It asks us to accept that something artificial can carry something real. The ending even complicates the traditional happy ending structure. By allowing the characters to experience genuine loss before they receive emotional victory, the theater is nearly lost. The money goal is missed. The old certainty is gone. Yet the community has been restored. The film does not claim that the past can be perfectly recovered. It claims that meaning can be recreated. That philosophy extends directly into the technical craft of the movie. The practical puppetry is not merely an aesthetic choice. It is the physical foundation of the performances. Veteran puppeteers such as Steve Whitmire and Eric Jacobson had to work within a production environment designed for modern cameras, high-definition imagery, complicated staging, and large ensemble scenes. Traditional rod work, hidden performers, floor trenches, and carefully planned camera angles were essential. The performers often had to operate characters from physically demanding positions that were invisible to the audience but very real on set. A digital creature can be animated from a comfortable workstation. A Muppet performer may spend an extended take in a cramped or awkward position, while maintaining a character's expression, timing, and interaction with other performers. That physical commitment gives the characters their weight. When Walter turns his head, it feels like his entire body is responding. When Fozzie moves, the movement contains tiny imperfections that reveal the human performer underneath. Modern visual effects then become servants rather than replacements. Rods and unwanted performers can be digitally removed. Green screen elements can be cleaned up. Backgrounds can be adjusted. But the core performance remains physical. This distinction matters because digital cleanup can remove evidence of the mechanism without removing the consequences of the mechanism. The puppet still compresses. The fabric still moves. The body still reacts to gravity. The physical laws of the performance remain intact. High-definition photography makes this even more impressive because it exposes texture. Felt is not smooth digital skin. Foam is not perfect plastic. Hair, seams, fabric, and tiny imperfections become visible. Instead of hiding those details, the film uses them to create tactile reality. That tactile reality becomes especially important during large crowd sequences, where dozens of performers and characters have to be staged with precise timing. The final Hollywood Boulevard musical number is a logistical achievement as much as a comedic one. Each character must occupy the correct physical space, while maintaining the illusion that the Muppets are participating naturally within a live-action environment. The result feels spontaneous, but spontaneity is often the product of extremely careful blocking. That is the paradox of practical effects. The audience experiences freedom, while the performers experience discipline. The Muppets look chaotic because the filmmakers have controlled the chaos precisely enough to let it breathe. James Bobin's directorial style is equally important. His background in Flight of the Conchords gave him an understanding of comedy that depends on deadpan reactions, awkward pauses, musical structure, and characters who do not always recognize how ridiculous they appear. That sensibility fits the Muppets perfectly. The film can move from broad slapstick to quiet sadness without feeling like it has changed genres, because the emotional sincerity remains consistent. Boban also understands the value of the fourth wall. The Muppets have always been comfortable acknowledging that they are performers inside a constructed show, and the 2011 movie embraces that tradition. Map transitions, script jokes, references to the movie's own structure, and characters who seem aware of their roles create a constant conversation between story and audience. But the fourth wall breaks rarely destroy emotional investment because the characters still care about what happens. That balance is difficult. If a movie becomes too self-aware, the audience may stop believing anything matters. If it becomes too sincere, the Muppet absurdity can feel constrained. Boban's direction finds the middle ground by allowing the joke and the emotion to exist simultaneously. A character can acknowledge the absurdity of the situation while still genuinely hurting. A musical number can parody a familiar genre, while also advancing the character's psychology. A celebrity cameo can be ridiculous and still reinforce the film's central argument about cultural relevance. Pacing is crucial to making that work. The Muppets can move rapidly through a montage of international recruitment, and then suddenly stop for a quiet conversation between Kermit and Walter. That change of speed gives emotional moments greater weight. The filmmakers also had to manage the physical realities of working with dozens of veteran puppeteers. Every complicated performance required coordination between the performer, camera operator, actors, director, and sometimes visual effects team. The apparent simplicity of a Muppet walking across a room can hide a remarkably complicated choreography. The directorial challenge was therefore not simply to make the puppets look good. It was to make the audience forget how difficult it was to make them move. The greatest compliment to the production may be that the craft rarely calls attention to itself. We laugh at the characters, not the technology. We feel their emotions instead of thinking about the machinery. That is exactly what practical filmmaking should accomplish. Music is where the film's emotional architecture becomes almost impossible to ignore. Christoph Beck's orchestral work gives the Muppets a cinematic scale that their physical bodies might otherwise seem incapable of carrying. The score understands that the emotional stakes are enormous, even when the characters are visually tiny. A frog can feel like the protagonist of an epic because the music treats his decisions as epic. Classic Muppet motifs are woven into the score, so that familiar musical ideas trigger memory before the audience consciously identifies why the scene feels nostalgic. Themes associated with The Muppet Show and Rainbow Connection carry emotional histories of their own. When those sounds return, they do not simply remind us of previous films or television episodes. They remind us of earlier versions of ourselves. That is one of the reasons musical nostalgia can be so powerful. A melody can bypass intellectual analysis and connect directly with memory. The instrumentation also helps preserve the handmade identity of the franchise. Banjos, whistles, acoustic textures, and accordion-like colors give the music a folk sincerity that contrasts with the larger orchestral passages. The score can become grand without becoming sterile. That combination mirrors the film's visual strategy. Modern cinematic scale surrounds old-fashioned physical materials. The result is not a conflict between old and new, but a conversation between them. Sound mixing creates another layer of difficulty. Puppeteer voices and live performances have to feel integrated with human actors, studio recordings, crowd noise, music, and effects. The audience should never feel as though one group of characters belongs to a different sonic universe. That integration is essential because the Muppets only work when they feel like participants rather than animated inserts. Their voices carry physical personality. Kermit's softness, Fozzie's nervous delivery, Animal's explosive energy, Piggy's confidence, and Walter's uncertainty all depend on performance texture. The sound design reinforces that physicality through tiny details. Footsteps, fabric movement, squeaks, squishes, and exaggerated vocal textures make the characters feel embodied. We may know intellectually that the Muppets are objects, but the sound makes their bodies feel alive. Bret McKenzie's songs take that emotional machinery and turn it into narrative structure. Life's a Happy Song is the perfect opening because it establishes an almost aggressively optimistic worldview. Its musical construction feels expansive and cheerful, with characters joining the number as though happiness is a contagious physical force. But that brightness becomes more meaningful after the rest of the film reveals how fragile the characters' happiness actually is. The song is not false exactly. It is aspirational. It describes the world the characters want to believe in. Pictures in My Head moves in the opposite direction. It is reflective, mournful, and built around the emotional experience of looking backward at memories that cannot be recreated. Kermit sings as someone who has allowed nostalgia to become painful. The images in his mind are not enough to bring the past back, and that gap between memory and reality becomes one of the film's most important emotional spaces. Then comes Man or Muppet, which takes an absurd premise and gives it the structure of a genuine identity crisis. The song functions almost like a psychological dialogue between possible selves. Walter and Gary each confront a version of themselves that represents a different future. The music is deliberately dramatic, almost parodically earnest, but the emotional conflict remains sincere. That is the Muppet songwriting philosophy at its best. The joke does not cancel the emotion. The joke gives the emotion permission to exist without embarrassment. Even the sound effects contribute to this worldview. The little physical noises associated with felt characters remind us that these beings have bodies. A puppet stepping, falling, turning, or reacting produces a sound that reinforces the tactile illusion. Sound design therefore becomes another argument for practical performance. The characters are not floating digital images. They occupy physical space. They have weight. They make noise. And because the film understands how much of our emotional connection to the Muppets comes from sensory memory, those tiny details matter enormously. When the Muppets opened in November 2011, the immediate reaction reflected exactly what the filmmakers had hoped to accomplish. The film found a way to appeal to adults who remembered the characters while remaining accessible to younger audiences. Its Thanksgiving release gave it a strong family-friendly window, and its opening weekend demonstrated that the franchise still had theatrical life. The critical response was broadly enthusiastic, particularly toward the film's affection for the characters, musical energy, and willingness to acknowledge the passage of time. That praise was significant because critics were not simply rewarding a nostalgia trip. They were recognizing that the movie understood why the Muppets had mattered in the first place. The soundtrack also became part of the cultural conversation. Man or Muppet eventually earned Bret McKenzie an Academy Award for Best Original Song, creating the wonderfully strange spectacle of a Muppet movie song being celebrated at one of Hollywood's most prestigious ceremonies. Online audiences responded strongly to the emotional moments as well, particularly Kermit's return to Rainbow Connection. In an internet culture that often turns sincere emotion into irony almost immediately, the response to those scenes demonstrated that people were still willing to openly care. The film had created a strange bridge between old television culture and digital culture. The Muppets could exist in memes, clips, social media conversations, and online nostalgia without losing their emotional identity. That is a remarkable achievement for characters whose origins were tied to a very different media environment. The movie did not merely survive the transition into the internet age. It used self-awareness to make that transition part of its appeal. Its longer influence becomes clearer when viewed alongside the legacy sequel wave that followed. The Muppets helped demonstrate a structure that later became increasingly common. Acknowledge the time that has passed, admit that the characters and audience have changed, honor the emotional importance of the original, and then create a new story around that gap. Years later, films such as Creed and Top Gun, Maverick would use variations of the same strategy, allowing older characters to confront their own histories while transferring emotional responsibility to a younger generation. The Muppets did not invent the idea of legacy storytelling, but it provided a particularly clean example of how nostalgia could be transformed into narrative conflict. The film's famous identity question, "Am I a man or am I a Muppet?" also survived because it works beyond its immediate joke. It became a shorthand for identity, belonging, and the strange experience of being caught between worlds. The franchise continued with Muppets Most Wanted in 2014 and later television projects, including Disney's attempts to find new formats for the characters. Yet the 2011 movie remains distinctive because it understood the emotional problem so clearly. It did not treat the Muppets as characters who simply needed more screen time. It treated them as characters who needed a reason to exist again. That distinction is why the film continues to occupy a special place in the post-Henson history of the franchise. It may not have permanently restored the Muppets to the cultural dominance of their original era, but it demonstrated that the characters could still carry a major feature film without surrendering the qualities that made them special. The critical reception also reveals an interesting generational divide. The film was widely praised by critics, with the strong Rotten Tomatoes reception reflecting appreciation for its warmth, humor, music, and respect for Muppet tradition. But audience reactions were never going to be completely uniform because the Muppets mean different things to different generations. Older viewers may immediately understand the rhythm of vaudeville comedy, the value of a deliberately bad joke, and the pleasure of watching characters break the structure of a conventional narrative. Younger viewers raised primarily on modern 3D animation may approach the film without that cultural vocabulary. To someone unfamiliar with the Muppets, a character deliberately looking at the camera or a joke about being inside a movie can seem strange rather than nostalgic. That does not necessarily mean the film fails. It means that some of its humor depends on cultural context. The Muppets are fundamentally theatrical characters. Their comedy is built around timing, interruption, repetition, audience awareness, and ensemble dynamics. Modern animated franchises often rely on faster visual movement, elaborate world building, and cinematic spectacle. The Muppets rely on performers standing in a room and committing completely to an absurd idea. That difference can create a generational gap. There are also legitimate criticisms. The human storyline involving Gary and Mary occasionally takes attention away from the Muppet ensemble. Some classic characters receive less development than longtime fans might want. The film's very nostalgia can sometimes make it feel as though it is explaining why the Muppets deserve love rather than simply allowing them to be funny. Yet these weaknesses are part of the larger risk the film was taking. It needed a new audience entry point, and Walter and Gary provide that entry point. Without them, the movie might have become inaccessible to viewers who did not already care about the franchise. The balance is imperfect, but the intention is understandable. The film also faced criticism from within the wider Muppet community, and from commentators who interpreted Tex Richmond differently. Frank Oz's concerns around the handling of character voices and characterization reflected a larger issue facing the franchise. How do you continue characters whose identities were historically tied to specific performers? A Muppet performance is not simply a voice. It is a combination of voice, movement, rhythm, timing, attitude, and the history between performer and character. Replacing or transitioning between performers can therefore feel more complicated than recasting an ordinary fictional role. Steve Whitmire's long association with Kermit made continuity particularly sensitive. Audiences are not only hearing a character, they are hearing decades of accumulated performance history. Other criticisms focused on the film's treatment of supporting characters. Ralph, Scooter, Janice, and others are present, but not always given the dramatic space that longtime fans might expect. That is a fair criticism because the Muppets have historically thrived through ensemble chemistry. When the film focuses heavily on Walter, Gary, Mary, and Kermit, some of the original ensemble energy inevitably becomes secondary. Then there was the political interpretation of Tex Richman. Some commentators viewed the villain as an overly simple representation of corporate greed or anti-capitalist messaging. But the character is so exaggerated that treating him as a detailed political argument may give him more ideological sophistication than the movie intends. Richman is a fairy tale villain operating inside a meta-comedy. He is designed to represent a particular kind of value system, the belief that everything can be reduced to property. The film is less interested in economic theory than in the emotional difference between ownership and belonging. Still, the criticism is useful because it reminds us that nostalgia itself is political in a broad cultural sense. Whenever a movie argues that older forms of entertainment deserve preservation, it is implicitly asking what kinds of culture society chooses to protect. Financially, The Muppets became an important demonstration that a family film did not necessarily need a gigantic blockbuster budget to become successful. Produced for a reported budget around $45 million, the movie earned roughly $165 million worldwide. That figure is significant not because it transformed Disney's finances, but because it validated the underlying business model. A practical puppet film could generate substantial theatrical revenue without requiring the scale of a $200 million effects spectacle. Its appeal came from a combination of holiday timing, cross-generational marketing, recognizable intellectual property, music, merchandise potential, and relatively controlled production costs. The Muppets were already an established brand, so the film did not have to build recognition from nothing. At the same time, the movie's marketing presented the characters in a way that felt accessible to people who had never seen the original television series. Theatrical revenue was only part of the ecosystem. Merchandise, soundtrack sales, home entertainment, and the renewed visibility of the brand all contributed to the broader commercial value. The film therefore demonstrated a useful lesson about franchise economics. A property does not need to dominate the global box office to prove that it remains valuable. It needs to create enough cultural momentum that audiences begin interacting with it across multiple platforms. Disney followed the theatrical success with Muppets Most Wanted and continued exploring ways to use the characters across television, parks, merchandise, and streaming. Yet the trajectory also revealed how difficult it is to sustain the exact creative chemistry that produced the original revival. Jason Segel's personal enthusiasm had been an important part of the project's identity, and his reduced involvement afterward changed the creative equation. This is another version of the same problem the film itself dramatizes. Reviving something is easier than maintaining the emotional conditions that made the revival special. Historically, the film's importance extends beyond its box office. It helped demonstrate that physical performance could still command major cinematic attention in an era increasingly dominated by digital imagery. That matters because puppetry is not simply a special effect. It is a performance discipline. A puppeteer has to communicate character through physical restriction, often without receiving the facial feedback that an actor gets from their own face. The result is a form of acting that depends on precision, rhythm, and collaboration. The recognition given to Man or Muppet through the Academy Awards placed that tradition inside a major contemporary Hollywood institution. It was a strange but meaningful milestone. A song written for a movie about felt characters had entered the same awards conversation as songs from conventional live-action films. More broadly, the Muppets helped preserve the idea that audiences could emotionally invest in hybrid worlds where physical objects and human performers share the frame. That philosophy would continue to appear in projects that blended puppetry, animatronics, practical creatures, and digital effects. Films such as Paddington and later hybrid franchises like Sonic the Hedgehog would approach the challenge differently, but the underlying cultural lesson remained relevant. Audiences do not automatically reject artificial-looking characters. They reject characters who feel emotionally artificial. A creature can be visibly constructed and still feel alive if the performance is convincing. That is one of the Muppets' greatest contributions to screen culture. They prove that visible artifice does not prevent emotional realism. And yet, like every film, The Muppets is also a product of its time. Some elements have aged beautifully. The practical puppetry remains tactile. The songs remain memorable. The emotional themes have arguably become more relevant. The tension between nostalgia and progress is more recognizable now than it was in 2011. The question of whether handmade creativity can survive inside an increasingly digital entertainment economy has only become more complicated. Other elements, however, are unmistakably tied to the early 2010s. Certain celebrity references, contemporary music choices, and pop culture jokes can feel like time capsules. Mentions of figures and trends that were instantly recognizable in 2011 inevitably lose some impact as the cultural landscape changes. But those dated moments are not necessarily flaws. They can also become evidence of the film's place in history. The more interesting question is what survives after those references disappear. And what survives is remarkably substantial. The tactile aesthetic survives. The songs survive. Walter's identity crisis survives. Kermit's loneliness survives. The debate over whether nostalgia should preserve or imprison us survives. The movie may actually become more emotionally powerful as viewers age, because the viewer's relationship to the themes changes. At 20, you might see Gary's conflict with Mary as a relationship problem. Later, you may recognize it as a story about the fear of adulthood. You may initially see Kermit as a sad old frog. Later, you may understand him as someone experiencing the terrifying realization that the world you helped create is continuing without you. You may see the theater as a funny abandoned set. Later, you may recognize it as a metaphor for every cultural space you assumed would always exist. That is what makes rewatching the film different from simply remembering it. The movie itself changes because the audience changes. After examining all of these layers, the verdict becomes difficult to avoid. The Muppets is not flawless. Its middle act can feel uneven. The human storyline sometimes occupies more space than the ensemble deserves. Several beloved characters function primarily as supporting players when they could easily sustain entire sequences themselves. Some of the humor is deeply rooted in the cultural moment of 2011. But those weaknesses do not erase what the film accomplishes. It is extraordinarily difficult for a studio to revive a legacy property without either turning it into a museum piece or stripping away the qualities that made it special. The Muppets manages to avoid both traps. It respects the past without pretending the past can be restored. It introduces a new protagonist without treating the old characters as obsolete. It uses modern filmmaking technology without replacing practical performance. It makes fun of its own nostalgia without becoming cynical about nostalgia itself. Most importantly, it trusts the audience to understand sincerity. The film never acts embarrassed about caring. It can make a ridiculous joke about a frog, then immediately allow that frog to express genuine loneliness. It can parody a villain's song and still make the villain emotionally understandable. It can turn a question about being a man or a Muppet into a surprisingly touching exploration of identity. That tonal confidence is rare. The Muppets knows that absurdity and emotional honesty are not opposites. In fact, they have always been partners. The original Muppets worked because they could be ridiculous one second and unexpectedly profound the next. The 2011 movie understands that tradition and translates it into the language of a modern legacy sequel. If the definition of a modern masterpiece is a film that understands its own historical position while still functioning emotionally on its own, then The Muppets comes remarkably close. It is not simply a successful revival. It is a film about why revivals are difficult. It understands the danger of nostalgia and then uses nostalgia anyway. It understands that franchises can become corporate products and still insists that audiences can give them meaning. It understands that the original era is gone and still finds a reason to sing. And perhaps that is why Kermit and the Muppets continue to matter. The deepest lesson of Rainbow Connection is not that some magical future is waiting for us if we believe hard enough. The more meaningful lesson is that connection itself requires a choice. You have to choose to care. You have to choose to show up. You have to choose to make something when the easier option is to consume. The Muppets survive because people decide they are worth gathering around. The theater becomes meaningful because someone is willing to perform inside it again. Walter becomes a Muppet because he stops watching from the audience and steps onto the stage. Kermit becomes a leader again because he accepts that leading does not mean recreating the past. Gary grows up because he learns that adulthood does not require abandoning the person he used to be. Even the crowd outside the theater becomes part of the answer. Culture is not ultimately preserved by buildings, contracts, logos, or corporate ownership.